And here we go. Well, welcome everyone to this very special edition of the ITMI Study Hall with our guest Study Hall monitor, Mary Ellen Pauli. And I'm going to let Mary Ellen introduce herself in just a moment. Before we do that, I want to go through the rules of the road. So you guys are pros by now, but for some of you, it could be your first time. So here are just some of the rules of Study Hall. And for those of you that are your first time, welcome very much. Although we call it the ITMI Study Hall, again, this is always open to everyone in the tour and travel industry. So thank you for sharing that around. And it's really amazing to see all of you guys from all over the world. So with that, please stay muted unless you have a scenario that you would like to add a suggestion to. So everyone just go ahead and start muting on down your microphones. If more than one person answers at the same time, don't worry. We're going to get both of you guys in there. So don't worry about that at all. And we'll make sure that we give a kind of a 1, 2, 3 and double check before we head on to the next scenario. Please keep all of your responses as brief as possible. So it gives those wanting to add in their experience the opportunity. Please be respectful of others' positive solutions. The solution may not be how you would handle it, but that is the whole point of Study Hall, for us to share our experiences and those things that have worked really well for us. This session is being recorded for training purposes, so if you do not want to be seen, please turn off your video camera. And if Mary Ellen or I happen to cut you off because you guys have been going a little too long, just know we do it in love, or at least I know I do it in love. Okay, Mary Ellen's doing it in love today. I like that as well. So if we do it, we just want to make sure we get a chance for everyone to go in the time that we have. Please do not circle back to a previously answered scenario or introduce another scenario during your comment, because it takes everyone off point. However, with that being said, if this sparks an inspiration of a scenario that you would like to see us feature on a future study hall, go ahead and either add it into the chat, or you can reply back to any of the messages that you get from ITMI and send us an email. Lastly, if you're chiming in, please make sure that it answers the scenario and it isn't just a comment. Okay, perfect. With that, we will get started and welcome everyone. Mary Ellen Pauli with WorldStrides. Take it away, Mary Ellen.
Thank you. I want to thank the ITMI staff for inviting me to host this, because I'm only doing it because ITMI has been so wonderfully supportive to all of us tour operators. This has given me an opportunity to play the role I've always wanted, that of a talk show host. So I've already alerted senior management that if I'm discovered, I'm out of here. It's also given me an opportunity to play teacher, which is kind of terrifying. Danny sent me a cute picture of what this might look like if we were all in a room together. But my greatest fear is that nobody will speak. So if you don't speak, I will call upon you, because I've got your names and your photos up there. And I do want to reiterate what Amy said. If you find this is boring and you decide to start chopping vegetables for dinner or doing yoga, be sure to turn your camera off, because tour operators are participating on this as well, and they're looking at potential tour directors. We may be in a very slight hesitation right now where groups aren't traveling, but travel will resume. We will resume hiring, and we'll remember the people who left their camera on when they were chopping vegetables or doing yoga. So that said, I'd like to pose a question. I'm following Paul Searner because I thought it was brilliant when he said, let's just not talk about COVID. We still have way too many questions, way more questions than answers when it comes to COVID. So I hope we can spend the time we have together focusing on the positive once students are traveling again, because I work with WorldStrides, an educational student travel company. And I thought that what we might do is look at all the events that have happened in this year. And if you could share how you think you would enhance or change your commentary, given all the events, the fact that this is the year we're celebrating 100 years of the suffragist movement and women having the vote, the Black Lives Matter, the protests in the streets. I'm very curious to hear how you might enhance or revise your commentary. You can pick a city, you can pick a site, you can pick a memorial. But if you would just think about that and share with us, I think it would be a great way to start. So Amy told me to give you a few minutes to think about this. I'll give you a few minutes and then I'll start calling on people.
I'll jump in.
Thank you so much. I was staring right at your photo, Debbie. Go ahead.
what I've done in the past, and I anticipate continuing to do it, when I go to the Lincoln Memorial with student groups, I talk about civil rights and significant events that have happened there, starting with Marian Anderson in 1939, being prevented from performing at Constitution Hall because she was Black. Simple, the only reason. And the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, made arrangements for her to perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday morning, 1939. And then I said, let's fast forward to August 1963. What famous speech was delivered here? Obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Let's fast forward to 2009, a pre-inaugural musical celebration of our first African-American president took place at this site. And then I'll ask the kids, I'll say, from 1939 to 2009, over 70 years, have we made a lot of progress in the area of civil rights? And obviously the answer is yes. And then I'll ask them, has everything been fixed? No. I said, well, who needs to continue the work to fix what still needs to be fixed? And I'm throwing a challenge to them to turning the mantle over to them, that they need to continue working on the issues in our country that need to be addressed and fixed.
So Debbie, that's what you said you've done in the past. Are there
I've already done it, yes.
Yeah, so do you have any questions you would ask of students now when you're taking them, hopefully in 2021? Are there any questions you'd ask them about what they've witnessed during 2020?
Yes, again, it would be, it's very much in our faces right now that there are still issues to be addressed. And I might ask them if they're, as opposed to being the general, who's going to do the work, maybe ask them if they have specific ideas of what they can do in their communities or in their future, what plans they might make to address the issues that still need to be addressed.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to share? Are there any sites that you would try to include in the itineraries that maybe haven't been covered before? Anybody out there?
One of the things, this is Julie, one of the things I would do is I often ask, what is going on in your community before I address the situation, because it's not just what they saw on the news or in Washington, D.C. or different cities. What was going on in your town? And then you might have seen on TV, and then talk about where we are if we're in Washington, D.C. Here's what happened here, either at the Lincoln Memorial or over by the White House, different things. And then, like Debbie said, what can we do to change, not just here, but in your hometown? And what steps have you taken there? So.
Okay.
This is Bob. Excuse me. This is Bob. I do student tours, and I've always found it helpful to do a little bit of upfront couching of the tour, just in terms of, we're going to a big city. Some of you haven't done that before. We're going to stick together and so forth. Because you never know what concerns people have, spoken or unspoken. But I think now I might even couch the tour a little bit differently at departure or as we get closer to our first destination by saying things like, look, it's very likely we could see things that arouse strong feelings and strong opinions, from a protest to a memorial that might be of a very imperfect person, even though there are people who have done important things, to signage, to what have you. And it's important that we all respect each other in that sense, because we probably don't all have the same perspectives and opinions on things. So I think I might start in on this very early in the tour.
Bob, thanks for bringing that up, because you're reminding me that one of the questions too was, how would you respond to a student who's asking, why are we looking and talking about memorials and monuments to people who owned enslaved people?
Well, if I can jump in for a second, I was doing tours out in Canton, China, and a lot of what I had to deal with were people not necessarily involved in the slave trade, but those involved in the drug trade, in the opium trade. And so a lot of the sites that I would take students on or guests on, we talk a lot about context and try to help them understand, why did these people see the need to involve in this business? What did they profit from it? What were their personal views at the time? How was it influenced by historical context? And I also like highlighting different roles that people played in the community, especially if they were women, which is not really talked a lot about, not just in China, but in terms of the foreign communities in China. And probably how I would do it differently now because of COVID is, ironically, in the turn of the century, that the plague that ended up coming to San Francisco right about 1900, it actually came through Canton and Hong Kong before that. So I would probably include more of material about that and talk about, why that happened, what were some of the experiences like, and also maybe communicate about different cultural values of health and safety. And if you're coming to a foreign country, how you, especially in these times, what can you do to, be safe and healthy, but how can you also do that in a very culturally sensitive way? Because you might see in people who do things very differently, that might make you feel a bit uncomfortable, especially with these COVID times. So how do you sort of interact with those differences of cultural identity and values when it comes to health or medicine or healthcare at that time? So just things like that.
Okay, so Shane, you bring up a good point of reminding people to look at these statues, these memorials, these monuments within the context of what was going on at the time that the memorials and the monuments were built. Anybody have anything else to add to that?
One thing something I usually skip when I'm in Arlington Cemetery is Medgar Evers' gravesite, and it's really accessible. It's pretty close to the beginning of a tour. And I think it would be interesting to visit his gravesite and talk about his connection with Martin Luther King and King's insistence that the protest be about civil disobedience, not about violence. And I think comparing those days to these days would be a way that I might try to go next year. I've been giving this a whole lot of thought in the last couple of months. So Medgar Evers may be on my new tour list in Arlington Cemetery.
That's a great idea and something we need to share with the rest of our tour directors and course leaders, incorporating that. Is there anybody else at Arlington that we perhaps have overlooked that you would think should be included going forward?
Well, I have something to say about that. At Arlington, where our representative, Don Beyer, is put through a move to change the name of the Robert E. Lee Memorial's Arlington House. That is the historic name. But there's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers of the Confederate and Union soldiers that are all buried together in one tomb up at the top of the hill. So you still can recognize those who served as on both sides, because that's what Lincoln's position was in his Gettysburg Address. And then that ties into the Lincoln Memorial. You can be fair and you can be historic, but there's some people who still hold on to some very, very strong views in a historic context. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not a revisionist, and I'm not someone calling for the the lost cause, that whole thing. But I do think that at Arlington Cemetery, we honor all of those who fell because the color of their blood is the same. And that's what Clara Barton said. And that people do have very strong views, and they can be very emotional. And that all of the names of the people on the tombs are from different cultures. They're Spanish, they're French, they're German, they're English, they're Irish. They're all have come to the United States, and they've served in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Melanie. I appreciate that.
The other thing too is that when I go down Pennsylvania Avenue, I bring up now the suffragists, the famous March of 1913, which was the harbinger of things to change by 1919 and the 1920. So I bring up the lesser known suffragists like Wilhelmina Keke Lau Kalana Nui Wideman Dowsett, who was the first suffragist in Hawaii, member of the royal court of the Queen. And she proposed ideas that all women, whether they be Asian or Chinese, Hawaiian, white, all women of Hawaii should have the right to vote. And she pushed for that because in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which didn't allow Asian immigrants from when they came to the United States to become US citizens. And without being a US citizen, they couldn't vote. And so there were suffragists who, no matter what, supported the suffragist movement, even though they themselves would not benefit. And so it is to their credit that we got the right to vote, that women got the right to vote in 1919, and then it was ratified, 1 year later, 1920. So
Thank
we
you,
need to
Melanie.
honor those people who have those positions that had a great self-sacrifice for the
Right.
greater good.
We focused a lot on Washington, D.C. Is there anybody outside of D.C., New York, Boston, that you'd like to chime in about sites or memorials in your cities and how you might treat them differently for students or adults?
Hi, this is Julie again. When I go out west, there are a couple of things that we mention, of course, and it's when you're out near Yellowstone and Wyoming, you're talking about the Plains Indians. So that just brings in the whole Indian relocation, reservations, all of that, and just the role of the government in that, and where we are today, because you're going through reservations, you're going onto reservations at Little Bighorn and different places. But then also outside of Cody, we talk about Heart Mountain Relocation Center, where during World War II, it was one of the camps where people of Japanese descent, even they were American citizens, they just were Japanese, were rounded up there. So those kinds of things, people are looking at this beautiful landscape, but it's, this is what happened here, and some of it is ugly, some of it is good, but we've come a long way from all of that. So
Right.
those are two things.
Judy, you mentioned the Underground Railroad. Do you want to share with us? No?
She might not be in a place where she can chat. I know there's a lot of people, right, that sometimes listen in when they're at work or doing other things. I thought that was a great suggestion, Judy, the Underground Railroad and also the Bill of Rights. Let's see, Joan S. from the chat also was saying Thurgood Marshall is buried, which that's a great one in Arlington. So that's another really great one for Arlington.
And Judy just shared that her mic is not working. I sympathize.
Happens. But good suggestions, Judy. Thanks. You guys have chat coming.
Also in
Illinois, so of course it's Lincoln here,
Right.
and I probably would talk about how Lincoln's beliefs changed over his lifetime about slavery, and he gradually got more and more knowledge and changed the way he believed and ultimately freed the slaves. And then talk about how do our beliefs change, and what do you think this year that you might not have thought last year, and have you gained empathy for the way other people think? And maybe some situations, like think of a situation if there are police outside your door, or you've been in a fight in the playground, or you heard a sexist joke or something. Do you think your reaction might be different from somebody who's a different color or a different gender? And try to get out those, because one of the things I try to get out is that white privilege thing. How we're not scared when there's a policeman at the door. And we tend not to think that that's an effect of race. We tend to think only about Black people when we're talking about race, but we have to think about the way we feel differently in certain situations than other people do. And are we learning more about how other people think and feel?
Thank you, Terry. Those are all really good questions to ask.
Also, another site that could invite conversation is in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the Massasoit statue up on Coles Hill. A lot of people think that was put there, to honor the Wampanoag tribes, and it was, but the Wampanoag tribes themselves don't view that as a place of honor. They don't view the Thanksgiving or the Pilgrims' arrival as a great thing. They view it as a means of taking away their land and slaughtering their people. So it would be a good place to, not just for students, but also for adults, to talk about the way that the Native Americans were treated once the Pilgrims made their landing, not only the Pilgrims, but also the English in Virginia too, back in the 1600s. So.
I just want to make one clarification about that, okay? If you read Philbrick's book, Mayflower, he went to the Wampanoag and he spoke with them. And actually it was Winslow who cured Massasoit of typhus with chicken soup. And the original Pilgrims actually got along with the first Indians that they met. But when the Puritans came, then the land was sold for pittance to the Puritans, and then the ground escalated. But the original Pilgrims and the original group did not flourish. They did not really benefit from land purchases. So it's a clarification, and they do come together every year to mark the arrival of the Pilgrims. But it is definitely a different perspective from the perspective of the American Indians that were there.
Thank you, Melanie. Anybody in New York? No?
This is Marty from New York. I can speak a little bit to this issue.
Thank you, Marty.
Yes, just FYI, I live in the woods, so my sound goes in and out. If I go out, just move on. But one of the things when the kids ask that question that I feel it's important to say to them, you know, why don't we blah, 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 or why is there a change now? I would let the students just honestly know that when we know better, we do better. And that's a really important idea, because at the end, I'm going to ask them, now that you know better, what can you do better? And so the kinds of changes that I would make moving forward is, one of the things I did do is I emailed the Hispanic and the African American drivers, and I said, what can we do as guides to better elevate the African and American experience, or any minority experience, in Washington, D.C.? And one of the things that they talked most about is we don't hear the stories in the commentary. And so one is, for me, is to challenge myself. Every memorial that I go to, or every venue that I go to, is there a way, like Rhonda said, pulling in Medgar Evers, is there a way for me to tell the story of an African American, of a Native a Native American, a Hispanic? You know, is there a way for me to pull those stories out, include them in my commentary? The other thing is to let the students know that as guides, we are now educating ourselves more deeply with the Discovery Project and different kinds of trainings that we're going through, so that we have an eye, an ear, and a heart for some of the stories that haven't come out in the past. And the other thing is to let them know that for memorials to be created, the government provides the land, but funding needs to come from private sources for the memorials to be created. So like with Dr. King's memorial, a lot of that money came from his fraternity. And to challenge the students to think about, whose story would you like to be told in memorial here in Washington, D.C., and how might we begin the groundwork and fundraising to make those stories come alive? And if Washington, D.C. feels too big, how might they do it in their own area? Just kind of beginning to shift, to begin to shift the thinking. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much. I love when we know better, we do better. That is really something wonderful to carry on with every one of the groups that you have. Anybody else care to share or comment how you would answer if a student or an adult asked why we are talking about memorials to people who did things?
I really like the idea. I really like the idea of using culture. Right now, people, students, young people seem to be really keen on not appropriating culture, being culturally sensitive. If they've traveled in the US, they might understand different cultures, or Japan, honor cultures. And you can make the suggestion that people who lived in history were in a different culture. And in the same way we try to be sensitive to different beliefs from cultures around the world, we need to understand that it was a different time and the beliefs about things were differently there. We should talk to them about avoiding presentism, which is in history, it's an idea that we judge the past based upon the mores and values of our current culture. And we need to avoid doing that, that we need to look back and realize that they were doing their best in the culture that they were aware of. Might even introduce suggestions that there are things that we do now that at 50 years or 100 years from now might seem really abhorrent. It could be that our use of cars and driving might be abhorrent, or eating of meat might be something that is considered to be barbaric in 50 or 100 years.
Thank you, Gary. Good points.
I just wanted to add to just
question of me. Usually I bring up about when we go to Mount Vernon, and if the students don't ask, I do bring up the fact that, you know, George Washington was a slave owner, as was Thomas Jefferson and a lot of other founding fathers of our country. And that at that time it was just accepted. And like today, there are some things that are accepted that 100 years from now, people may look back and say, wow, I can't believe that. So, I mean, I do talk about, you know, a person like George Washington, even though he was a slave owner, you know, he was good to his slaves, and, you know, some of the things that he did to, you know, take care of them, see they were treated fairly, and, you know, things like that. And so that's why we're going to see people that were slave owners. It was accepted. And, you know, it's just like today, there's a custom that, you know, sometimes a woman or a minority doing the same job as a man gets paid less money. Well, hopefully someday we'll get past that so that everybody doing the same job will get paid the same money. And, you know, maybe 50 or 100 years from now, a student may ask, well, gee, how could they do that? You know, pay a woman or a minority less for doing the same job.
Thank you, Tony.
Just a comment on that George Washington was a good slave owner. One of my favorite historical interpreters at Mount Vernon portrays Christopher Shields, who was George Washington's personal valet. And if I see him on property, I try my best to have my students interact with him. And invariably, one of the students will say, well, wasn't George Washington a good slave owner? And he will give them a puzzled look and say, good slave owner? That's an oxymoron. How can someone who controls where you go, who you're with, who has you punished, this particular character was whipped for trying to run away, and from his perspective, historic perspective, how can you call someone who does that good? So again, you know, you have to put it in the context of the times. But I have never told my students that George Washington was a good slave owner because of that.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I recall George Early, who many of you may know, talking at Mount Vernon and saying something similarly, and I could not say it as articulately as you did, but thank you for saying that, because I have heard that comment made. Melanie, did you have something to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, about Thomas Jefferson, okay, yeah, he was a slave owner, but when you go to the Jefferson Memorial, I always point out the one panel when you go in just behind the statue where he talks about children growing out of their clothing. And so just as children grow out of their clothing, governments change. And that if you don't have a government that changes with the times and with civilization, then you always have a barbarous government. You'd be living in as a barbarian. Okay, and I'm just paraphrasing it, but that to me is code. That's Jefferson saying, I can't free the slaves right now. I can't do this if I'm going to create this country with these ideas. It's beyond my power. And when you read about the arguments of 3/5 of a person and voting and all the slaves and everything, that was the major block that kept the Constitution from being written, okay? So that is Jefferson signaling, not in my time, but in the future. And then roll up to Lincoln and how long it took and how long it takes for women to get the vote. But yet, then you have Grant, who inherited a slave, all right, and then he manumitted the slave. Or you have the Quakers and the Methodists in Alexandria, who got so good at purchasing slaves and manumitting them after teaching them to read and to get them a skill, but then they were forbidden in the House of Burgesses and the laws of Virginia to attend manumission hearings. So you see, it has to do with law and culture and the political will of the people to change these things, to change these ideas. I bring that out and I say, well, think about in school, everyone's thinking one way and then you think a little differently. Are you going to speak up and say, I don't believe that? Would you be honest, And they're like, so that's, I feel very strongly about this anyway.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Well, we don't have Renzo from Vancouver, BC. We don't have that many monuments as you have in the States. And, it's still, from outside, it still amazes me that there's still a struggle from the Black community. In the hippie time, there was Black is Beautiful. It seems it has always those sequences. It's being talked about it, and it flattens out sort of, and it comes up again. And I hope with this upsurgence of what you have in the States now, it's going to change all around the world. I think it's going to be a push to understand better the other cultures. Mm-hmm. And we have like any other country, also Canada's got this black eye, as black spots. Our first Prime Minister, MacDonald, signed a law that's basically our indigenous people has to be put the kids in residential schools so they control being able to speak their own language or culture. And in Vancouver also we have a statue. Never thought about it. Maybe I should put the statue in the museum being out again, maybe in 20, 30 years. So, to talk more about people. And we have this Jack Dayton in Vancouver. He married a Squamish Nation. She died. And then he married a 12-year-old girl. Now it comes actually basically, well, how can someone, a pedophile, marrying a 12-year-old girl? And then I was talking to a Squamish woman, said, well, at that time, when you were 16 and you were not married, hey, what are you doing? You're not married yet? Sure, right. 12 years was too young. Yeah, they said, well, maybe 14, you should get married. So
again, putting things into context.
Yeah. You have to just find a way to explain to people too, yeah, it was bad, but really bad. It's why, culture-wise too. And like most continents, they've got the culture differences, how Shane, I think, put it to another people. When you're growing up with a different culture in a different country, especially in Europe, you're bringing something different. You're not, how are you living? How are you doing this in this country? You have to adapt. But when you're coming into a country, it's very difficult to completely change your culture, right? You cannot change from, let's say, from Chinese or Japanese into Western culture. And also the other law, what we put through in the same thing on the States, interned the Japanese people 100 miles away from the West Coast. And years back, I had some problems to tell about it, what happened to the Japanese. And then one Canadian came up and said, well, do you know actually what the Japanese have done to the Canadians? And then I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't. But then I think and reinforce myself, these were 2 or 3 generation Japanese in Canada. They not even spoke Japanese. They didn't have the Japanese culture. And you just ship them away, take them everything away, basically. And I'm really admire these people from nothing coming back up again. If it was Japanese people or even indigenous people, they've got very strong now in Canada to come back up again and didn't lose their culture over 2 or 3 generations.
Thank you, Renzo.
So I hope with in the US that this new resurgence of equal rights, what you have in the States, it's going to push not only the States, so all around the world, what you're seeing demonstrations all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have any concerns about whether the students will be prepared when they could travel again because of what's going on with the educational system now?
I don't think, I think there's going to be a lot of holes. And so you can't, you're going to, I think as a guide, you'd have to just accept that there's just some things you still want to have it be fun. You want them to enjoy what they're doing and get their experience out of it. And I think there would be even a greater need for experiential learning. And then you honing down the principles and concepts that you want them to really take away from, at least from Washington, D.C., or from the place where they're visiting, you know. And one of the things I always like to do is to bring in foreign languages, because I speak French fluently. And I explain how the early French people that lived in New France before the English came, some of them spoke 14 Indian languages because they lived and they worked and they traded with so many of the Mohawk and the the Iroquois, the nations that were there, that were here at least on the Eastern Seaboard. So speaking the language was really important. And wampum, I'm searching for a wampum belt, but a wampum was a way of telling the stories of the American Indians, at least in the woodland tribes of the East Coast. So.
I think students will be prepared to travel. I substitute teach in school now. And the one thing I'm noticing about kids is, school is very different with all of this remote learning and in school. And the kids seem to be very flexible to what's going on. I mean, they seem to understand more why we have to do what we do right now in school than, the parents. You see a lot of parents out protesting that, they want their kids back in school if their school is on remote, or, they want sports back and things like that. But the kids are much more adaptable and understand what's going on. Sometimes I think more than adults want to be flexible. So I know it will be different when we get back to traveling, but I think kids will be very adaptable and very willing to, and really looking forward to traveling again.
Thanks, Tony. Sally, you had your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself and join us?
I will, but I didn't want to till I was on screen. I hadn't really thought about the students being prepared, but oh wow, I am terrified now. Honestly, I know that I'm not so much.
They have a clean slate to deal with.
Well, I'm not so worried about, normally when we get them in March or in the spring, they are almost up to the Civil War, so they have some sort of background. But that doesn't concern me as much as behaviors, where they have been basically, most of them not in school. They have been learning on their own. And many of them will be away from their parents for the first time. And it could be very interesting. It's something, as Mary Ellen, you've terrified me.
That's a good point. Very interesting is right, because if they've been alone, we are talking about having cohorts or pods to travel when travel does resume. So interesting is a good word. Challenging and scary and frightening probably are also good adjectives for that. Anybody else have any concerns? Okay.
In all truth, every group is different. You never know when you meet them at the airport, at the old post office. You don't know where they are as far as how far they've gotten into their curriculum. They come from 50 different states. They have different attitudes, different behaviors. Even from within the same state, you get differences. So we're going to probably have another layer of having to learn to read the group, but they're all unique anyway.
There's somebody who was waving, but there's no name on your screen. Yeah.
It's Charlotte.
Okay, Charlotte, please share.
I think it's going to be quite different, the student groups. I think their perspectives are going to change in light of everything that we've seen on our television screens over these last few months. School is traditionally a place where they go to learn about different perspectives and different attitudes and different points of view. But I think a lot of that is going to be shaped by what they're seeing on television and in the news. And I think that's going to be particularly true of our minority students. When I have a minority group, and I have often had in the past a minority group where I am the only white person on the bus. And it's particularly challenging, I think, to relate to white groups and Black groups perhaps in a different way. The point I'm trying to make is that I think that we have to be particularly sensitive maybe now to minority groups because of the things that they're observing on television. And I think that's particularly true if you have a minority group and you're the only white person there. And I have that perspective when I'm particularly at the Martin Luther King Memorial, for example, where I have a Black group. I try very hard to instill in them a sense of pride in their history and their tradition without being patronizing. And sometimes that can be a little difficult. But I think it's going to be a challenge, particularly for the minority groups this year because of what they've observed on television. And if you're trying to instill in them a sense of pride and a sense of history, I think it's going to be a bit more challenging than perhaps it's been in the past.
Charlotte, are there any places in Washington, D.C. that you haven't taken groups to before that you feel like you need to? Like we talked about Medgar Evers at Arlington National Cemetery. Any other memorials that you feel should be included?
I can't think of anything right now, Mary Ellen. Let me think about that.
Okay.
I'm thinking about whatever memorial might potentially go up to John Lewis, for example. Or a place where, John Lewis served in Congress for all of those years and was particularly influential in the civil rights movement, perhaps at the Capitol to speak about him and relate that to the work of Martin Luther King in the past. But I think it's important to relate the past to the present. It's one thing to teach history. It's another thing to put it in proper perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for speaking up.
Mary Ellen? So,
yes, Mike.
On the way to, we almost always go through Alexandria on the way to and from Mount Vernon.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we take the highway around, but that's rare. And we always pass, I was talking about Alexandria going through, there's a freedmen's cemetery there that I always point out. And I don't point it out every time, it just depends, but now I'll be more conscious of that. And it's on the way, you pass it at least once or twice, either going or coming or both. So I think that's something that we can have more.
That's a really good point. Thanks for sharing that.
There's also, it's small, but it's in the Capitol Visitor Center, a memorial to the enslaved labor that was used to build the Capitol building. And it's just off to one side. It'd be an easy, swing by and point it out when you're in there.
Right.
I think that, hi, this is Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. I think one of the most important things that people will be interested, students or adults, is Black Lives Matter Plaza.
Yes.
And it has not only importance for the controversial aspects of what happened there, but also how that plaza came about. And you can go to muralsdc.com, I believe it is, or something like that, where you will understand how it started from a phone call at 2 a.m. from the mayor and having the director of the murals program gather 7 artists to get down there. I mean, it was amazing. They literally did it in less than 24 hours. And so it's an amazing story to talk about. And so that's definitely going to be an important part of, I think, what a lot of people will ask for. And I always talk to my group leaders, chaperones, teachers, whatever. I always talk to them a week before my itinerary, and I go through everything with them so that in terms of understanding where the students are, that person obviously knows way more than I will ever be able to uncover. So I think that's really important. The tour directors need to talk to the group leaders to understand the students, where they're coming from, and then again, Black Lives Matters Plaza, which as far as I know, it's going to be permanent from H Street all the way up to K Street. No traffic, just the mural. So.
Barbara, thank you so much for reminding us about that. And can you say again what the website is that has the information?
You know, I would Google Murals DC.
Murals DC, okay.
Yeah, and that will lead you to a Department of Public Works. It's sort of an adjunct office or agency, but they are in charge of doing all the murals all across the city. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome.
We have like 9 minutes left. Does anybody have any burning issues they want to bring up?
I do.
Okay,
I feel as if Lafayette Square, I mean, the origin of protest at Lafayette Square is from the suffragist movement. And I'm going to mention that more, that the suffragists stood quietly outside with banners. And here Woodrow Wilson was, struggling for the freedom in Europe, and yet women didn't have the right to vote. And that exercising the rights to free speech under the First Amendment is what the peaceful protesting that goes on at Lafayette Square is all about, you know.
And what about the prison where the women who stood there and protested were put?
Yeah, and actually that turned against the anti-suffragist movement and the movement to get the Senate to vote. Wilson then, out of sheer political expediency, seeing that New York had just given, as a state, the women the right to vote, and went to the Senate and said, look, you guys have got to put this through. And it was Jeanette Rankin who put it through for vote in the House. All right, she brought it forward, okay? So, I mean, the whole process is like super interesting, it sort of just woof, 1919, 1920, just like woof, it just came and it happened, you know? But it had to do with the violence against the women, the force feeding through their noses of food was excruciatingly painful, which the suffragists had learned from the British women suffragists. So, I mean, it's kind of, when you start to talk about the dynamic of it, of people struggling for their rights, the right to vote, how precious it is. And we should never take it for granted.
Good point, especially this year.
One of the questions that was proposed was about if a student asks, why don't we see more statues and monuments to women and minorities? That's a good question. The one thing, before I give my answer, the one thing I like to do is whenever a student asks a really good question like that, rather than me answer their question, I like to propose, get the group all together, hey, Jimmy here asked a really good question, everybody gather around. Jimmy, why don't you repeat what your question is? And then since they're all, students of history and that, I like to start out by asking them, well, what do you think? Why don't we see more statues of women and minorities, and get as much input from them as you can before I, as the tour director, answer. And I think that accomplishes two things. A lot of us complain about, students are not engaged and, they spend their time looking on their phones rather than paying attention to us while we give commentary. Well, I think that's one of the problems is that if a student asks us a question and we start to answer it, the students shut off. Whereas if you get their engagement, their input, they're less likely to be looking at their phones and paying attention to us. So anyway, my answer is, I thought about this question and, it's kind of like the statues and memorials mirror kind of our history books. And if you look at our history books, they're mostly male-centered. And there's many great women in our history. There's many great minorities in our history that aren't even mentioned in the history books. One example I thought of was Frederick Douglass. We all know a lot about Frederick Douglass. We talk about him. But how many of us know much about his wife? My mother always used to remind my father that behind every great man, there's a great woman, which is true. And so when you look at Frederick Douglass's wife, Anne, you know, they were both from Virginia. He was born a slave into slavery. She was not. She was born free. And when they met, she was a domestic working as a maid in a house. So they got married. They had 5 children. All of his involvement with the Underground Railroad, she helped him with that. She followed him. She gave him 5 children. He had a couple of affairs, which she overlooked and still stayed with him. So, you know, it's just, that's a good answer, I think, to, you know, why isn't there a statue to Anne Douglas somewhere in.
So Tony, you might also ask the students who they think the statue should be built to. What people do they think the memorials or monuments should be built to? What individuals that they're thinking of? Yeah. Anybody else have any comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's important too, especially if you're dealing with students who are international or people coming to the States and don't have this kind of background. I've been dealing with, say, Chinese or Asian students for many years and trying to explain sort of the nuances of our culture and all these things is very challenging, especially since the past 7 years since I've been in China, the relationship between our countries has really deteriorated. And so being able to help them understand the complexities of these issues, why this stuff is important to our culture, but also trying to see from their perspective, where can they sort of connect to that story, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about is very relevant for students within our own country, but especially those who are coming to visit and maybe might be hesitant to come in the future because of things that have been happening. I think having that nuanced opinion and being able to explain things that helps them make those connections and helps them understand a culture that's foreign to theirs will also help them feel very comfortable coming here as well, as I lived in their context and their culture and helped make sense for foreigners in their culture and context to find that story. So I think that's something we can also be thinking about as well, not just for students in our own country, but for those who are coming for a visit, for school, you know, and especially in these times, it's important to help them understand what's going on here and why that's relevant to them as well.
Thank you, Shane. And somebody did share that in addition to Tony's comment was behind every successful man, there's a woman or mother and a surprise mother-in-law, woman or wife, or sorry, and a surprise mother-in-law. So with that, the producer is back on the screen, which signals it's time for study hall to end. I turn it over to Amy.
I think we have probably 1 or 2 more minutes if you guys can hang in. Our very last, it wasn't quite a scenario, but it was something. And I thought if we wanted to go quickly, so this is like super fast bonus round. But we have a lot of people that are, some new students, hi class 334, I see you guys out there, that will be entering 2021 is going to be kind of their first moment in the tourism world. And there are a lot of you guys out there that maybe haven't tried student tours, who are like, I don't know if I want to do student tours. I'm not quite sure. I've always done adult tours. I don't know if I like, so for those of you who have such a passion and joy for student tours, if you can, very briefly, so we can get as many people as you can, what wisdom would you share, or what would you have told yourself if you could go back to that very first nerve-wracking student tour, or what's the thing that brings you the greatest joy about student tours? I would just love to hear your thoughts. Just briefly, we'll take up our last couple of minutes.
Hey, Amy, this is Bob. 2 things. One is that even the smallest things can create lifelong memories for these kids. It might be going up and down the hotel elevator, you know, for the first time, or spending a night away from home for the first time. The other is that you inherit an organization when you're leading a student tour. You inherit a hierarchy with a lead teacher and so forth. And just to respect that and be mindful of it and learn how that works early in the tour, if not before.
I love watching the light bulb go off on the 8th grader's head. Sometimes they like, whoa, you can actually physically see it. Brings me joy.
One of the things I always tell them after, you know, one of my rules is read the walls. And because, you know, if stuff is written everywhere, so read the walls and touch the walls. Because when you go back home and you see this monument or this Capitol building or this whatever on TV or in the history book or whatever, you'll never ever look at it the same again. And so, because you were there, you read that, you know exactly what it means. And so that's it. They'll see it differently.
Student tours are fun, and kids are much more forgiving when you're new and you may make a mistake or say something that isn't correct than adults. So it's a great place to start your touring career.
Right. Marty, excellent. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Julie. Marty, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
My best piece of advice I can give to a new person is when we as old timers give you our phone number and say, call us with any question or concern anytime that you utilize it, because somebody was there for us and we will be there for you.
That's wonderful. Amy, thank you so much for reminding me of that last question. That's probably the most important one, and I missed that, so thank you.
And one of the things that we find, and I found in DC, is, you know, people that we just see in passing. And oftentimes, you know, you can find it, is the White House open? Or the Secret Service closed it down? You just kind of help each other along the way as you go along. I just remember one person, we needed a place for lunch. We were going to the Holocaust. I'd never been to the Department of Agriculture cafeteria. And so in the middle of Keybridge, you know, hotel lobby that morning, she just laid it all out for me. Here's what you do, here's where you go, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then off we went. Just 5 minutes of help that just was tremendous. So we help each other out. That's what we do. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add too that when a tour operator tells you that she's available by email, text, or phone, whatever, he or she, take advantage, because we really do. It's to our benefit to make sure the really great people stay in the industry. And what you're hearing right now is people help people. It's a wonderful industry, and it's very much it's a lot of teamwork that goes on.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I want to say, of course, a special thank you to our special edition student tour study hall monitor, Mary Ellen Pauli. Big round of applause.
Thank you for participating, to all of you. You guys made it happen.
Thank you guys so much for showing up. And of course, in just a moment, I'll be turning the cameras off for our world famous detention. Before that, I wanted to make an announcement. Next Wednesday, some of you have taken advantage and done recess before. If you don't know recess, stay tuned and I'll make sure everyone gets an email on that. But we will be doing a recess next Wednesday, the 23rd. And so what is recess? So recess is a place for us to connect, but of course, everything that we do when we play and get silly has a real life use to it. So we talk about games that we use on tours, great icebreakers for both student groups and adult groups. Of course, you're going to see the world famous Farquhars. If you don't know them, stay tuned, you'll see them next week. But all sorts of fun trivia and games to kind of keep us sharp and to utilize some of these things on tour. So look for tomorrow your replay from today's study hall, as well as invitation to recess next Wednesday. Thank you again, Mary Ellen. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Shared your wisdom. It was amazing. And with that, we'll see you guys next week.
Take care. Thanks.